The escalation of the Israel-Palestine conflict has consistently gone up, and with it, we see now that the U.S. is getting involved, as we see the fact is that airports outside of the conflict, like in Lebanon, have now been struck by the Israeli Air Force. We see the comments from Iran as well as Hezbollah talking about the fact of the persecution of the Muslim people and the people in Palestine, and the fact is that the people of the Taliban within Afghanistan are now claiming that they will gladly march upon Jerusalem to take the holy city. And the thing that is so unbelievable about this is that Israel's activation of the Muslim world may only further lead to their persecution and demonization to a higher scale than it already has been. Let's go ahead and jump into this. And the thing that I find so unbelievable is that the United States now getting involved, sending multiple carrier groups, announcing funding that of $10 billion, sending soldiers, and then claiming, well, don't worry, we're not actually getting involved in this conflict. Yeah, just like sending hundreds of billions to Ukraine isn't actually getting involved in this conflict. Let's go ahead and jump in. Once again, death and sorrow and destruction have sadly fallen upon the land of Israel and Palestine, and with it we see the consistency of this New Age holy war has ginned up to new heights, and well, what does that lead to? It leads to the destruction of people who are trying to live that of a civilized life, and with it we see Gaza before and Gaza after. Torn asunder, and I guarantee you a place where people once lived is now a place where children have most certainly died in the most horrific of ways. And this is the tragedy of war. On to Anya Parampel, she says, why do Americans who believe in free speech have to say about this? What does this tell us about our media in the United States? What are they so afraid of Americans finding out? MSNBC has censored Mehdi Hassan, Ayman Modine, and Ali Vilshi, and all amid the Palestine and Israel conflict. MSNBC suspends Muslim anchors amid Israeli war in Gaza. And I would consider MSNBC nothing more than smear merchants working for the establishment, because they are nothing more than regime alkalites at best. But the thing that I find so fascinating is that I believe that they're so consistent when it comes to tapping into nuance on this subject because of the nature of how it ties into their faith and maybe their beliefs going all the way back into that of their childhood and how they were brought up. Alright, now we're going to go ahead and jump in. Kim Iverson says, I really agree with MSNBC these days, but Ali Vilshi has to say it best. I too have seen the oppression with my own eyes. When you see it, you can't deny it. It's horrific. The most glaring example is how it is treated by American Palestinians who move back to build Palestine. Once they realize why they're there, they suddenly treat Americans born in America like trash simply because they are Palestinian. Man, this is honestly tragic, but let's go ahead and jump into this. And this clip is a perfect example of why MSNBC, which is nothing more than regime media's talking points at all times, is not allowing someone like Ali Vilshi on. Here we see an actual comment from Community Notes. It says, this video of Ali Vilshi is from May 15th, 2021, and it's not about the Israel-Hamas conflict in October of 2023. Well, here's the deal. His commentary rings just as true today as it did then, because the commentary of this conflict is the same argument that's been happening for decades. Now let's go ahead and jump into this clip.
One thing clear, Israel has a right to exist and to defend itself. That is an indisputable fact. But so do Palestinians, and that's a fact that's often ignored. Palestinians are, at best, third-class citizens in the nation of their birth. The idea that it's even remotely controversial to call what Israel has imposed on Palestinians a form of apartheid is laughable. One look at a current map of Israel, Gaza, and the occupied territories conjures up only one other example: apartheid-era South Africa. The Israeli government, on an ongoing basis, declares parcels of land on which Palestinians live to be either of military or archaeological importance, causing residents to be evicted. Sometimes there's a court case, and almost always the Palestinians lose. Yet months or weeks later, that same important land suddenly becomes home to a brand new Israeli settlement. As more and more Jewish settlers take over land on which Arabs live, the occupied West Bank becomes de facto more Israeli and, in the explicit hopes of the Israeli government, more Jewish. This is a long-standing attempt and a deliberate attempt to force Arabs who have lived in that land, sometimes for hundreds of years, out. It's an attempt to dilute their presence, because to have Arabs as full participants is, in the opinion of the Israeli government and their courts, diluting Israel. Just prior to the pandemic, I toured many of the contested areas and homes from which Arabs are being pushed out, both in Israel proper and in the occupied territories. Palestinians don't control the important parts of their lives. Palestinian families are refused permits to build or renovate their homes. When they connect their homes to the municipal water supply, Israeli soldiers sometimes cut the pipes. When they attempt to harness solar energy because their homes are not on the grid, Israeli soldiers literally come and remove solar panels from their homes. I spent an hour and a half traveling alongside an elderly Palestinian woman who was being transferred between 3 ambulances from Gaza to the no man's land in between and then into Israel to get cancer treatment. 3 ambulances over the course of 1 mile, more than an hour to cross the border. That's how Gazans live. Without medical treatment because Israel prevents it. Without electricity much of the time because Israel prevents it. Without the ability to fish in the Mediterranean Ocean because Israel prevents it. Without an airport or a seaport because Israel prevents it. Like Israelis, Palestinians also have a right to exist and to defend themselves. But there is no one willing to help them do that. Not the Israeli courts, and not the U.S. government. What the U.S. also shares with Israel is the belief that Hamas, the political party that governs Gaza, is a terrorist organization that calls for the destruction of Israel. Hamas is supported by the majority of Palestinians in Gaza. Hamas may not be in the best long-term interests of the Gazans, but peace hasn't really worked out for them. Faced with an Israeli government which pens them into what has been called the world's largest open-air prison, they have chosen a government that most of us wouldn't prefer. One that is not given to negotiation and moderation and respect for its neighbor. Israel needs a new approach to the Palestinians, and America needs a new approach to Israel. After more than 7 decades of not just being deprived of land from which they were evicted, Palestinian frustration runs deep. It may be worth going deeper than what you may hear inside your bubble and understanding the depth to which the Palestinian people are subject to apartheid in their own land, deprived of basic necessities, and subject to relentless civil rights violations. This is not a secret. It's out there for you to see. You just have to look for it.
Absolutely spot on when it comes to the nature of this conflict, and due to the fact that we already saw this commentary is from May 15th of 2021, well, what do we know? We know that the nature of this conflict has not evolved, and with it, neither has much of the commentary surrounding it, because it's the same old conversation that is consistently surrounding this entire ordeal. Now here's the thing. As we already saw, commentary like that is why MSNBC has suspended these 3. Muslim anchors suspended amid Israeli war in Gaza. Well, here's the deal. MSNBC is an American company, and we have freedom of speech here, and we have freedom of religion, and I would argue this is nothing more than religious persecution. This is not something that is tolerable in America whatsoever. This is outright fucking wrong, and it needs to be disputed, because this is not okay. I'm a Christian, and I'm not okay for this. This shit cannot be stood for. Now, we saw that Kim Iverson's commentary said she rarely agrees with MSNBC these days, and I fully agree. I hardly agree with anything they have to say, but I really appreciate the nuance that he provided to that. And we're going to be jumping into a video in just a second here, and we're just going to go ahead and play it, and it'll probably loop itself. But it says, during previous Israeli assaults on Gaza, Israelis pulled up lawn chairs on a hill in Sderot and cheered the missile strikes. Just another display of neo-colonial sadism here. And this is a tweet from Max Blumenthal. Max Blumenthal is a journalist who is an expert on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Here's the thing. He is talking about the nature of this video here when he talks about neo-colonial sadism. And this is a person after the blockades were announced, which is cutting off food, water, electricity, access to resources, accesses to being able to leave the conflict zone. He is doing this out of spite to the people of Palestine. And there is a degree of sadism that exists within some of the people within Israel as well as some of the people within Palestine towards their ideological opposition that would lead to someone doing something like this. We are talking about children. There are 1.1 million children at a minimum in Palestine who have been cut off from water, cut off from electricity, their hospitals are being bombed, their water salination plants are being completely destroyed by explosions. What else do we see? We see, on top of that, they've been completely removed from their ability to leave the conflict zone. They've been told to flee to certain areas to extract from the conflict zone, being denied at certain borders, having their way out through certain choke points bombed, even though they've been directed out through that way by the Israeli government. We see that they are not being allowed to flee into Israel. Egypt is not allowing them in through their border. Jordan is not allowing them in through their border. And all the while, you see that this is 1.1 million children that people like this are completely okay with seeing suffer because they do not view them as human. this is something that really bugs me, and we're going to go ahead and jump into this. And this is from Anya Parampel, and we'll play roughly a minute and 20 seconds of this video. It is absolutely disgusting. The degree of cognitive dissonance that exists within this woman's mindset is unbelievable. The fact that you would be rooting for the destruction of innocent civilians, because people that talk about the bombing of Hamas, they know that civilian casualties will come about because of it, and they are completely okay with it. Let's go ahead and jump into what she has to say.
Hi everyone. Woo, wow, can you hear that? It is, I think, 1 p.m. We are going to be leaving Ashkelon now because I just don't feel safe here. But I do want to give you one piece of good news, that day and night, every few minutes, sometimes seconds, I can hear our I.D.F, our incredible army, bombing the living daylights out of Hamas. And it is giving me so much strength. You can hear, I don't know if you guys can hear now. I hope that they are showing Hamas just this much of the wrath of God, showing them that if you touch a single hair on any Jew's head, we will come and we will bomb you until we just obliterate you from the face of the earth. Hamas is such pure evil. Anyways, here in Ashkelon we can hear.
She literally sits there and talks about, we will bomb you off the face of the earth. And I understand she's talking about Hamas, which absolutely is a terrorist organization willing to go to barbaric metrics to completely destroy civilization and civilized people and kill innocents and maim them and do absolutely horrific things. But the fact that she is saying, we will bomb you into oblivion, she's like, oh my gosh, they're so evil. It's like, the cognitive dissonance is unbelievable.
Hear everything. I'm going to Jerusalem now, God willing. We're going to leave because I just cannot take the constant bombing. And like the sirens are pretty much nonstop. I mean, like there's breaks in between. Anyways, that's my update. Hashem, please be with our soldiers. I'm so grateful to every single one of our troops for going to the most dangerous parts in Israel right now and fighting for us. And I can hear Hamas being pulverized, and it's the greatest sound I've ever heard in my life. All right, stay thirsty.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and leave that there. But here's the thing. The fact that we are talking about an area, which I've already mentioned this before, the densest, most populated place on the entire planet, it is 5 miles by 25 miles. It is more densely populated than India, more densely populated than Manhattan. And if you think that dropping bombs in these places is not harming innocent people, well, then you haven't been watching any of the footage that's been coming out of this war. Because now that we have the internet, the media has no capacity to curtail all of the stuff that we see, and they have no ability to construct the narrative by telling you, look here at this one little thing, hyperfixate on it, and make sure that this is the entire thing that activates you. Now we have a wide dispersion of information, and with it, we have the ability to weed through their bullshit. So, we're going to go ahead and jump into Mark Lamont Hill. And Mark Lamont Hill was actually fired from CNN in, I believe, 2018 or 2019. And this was because of his response, because of his commentary on the Israel and Palestine conflict, because he actually approached it with nuance rather than just coming at it like that of a propagandist. And here what we see is it says, Mark Lamont Hill puts interviewer to shame by forcing Israel's former foreign minister to admit that Israel is deliberately starving and bombing a captive civilian populace to get what they want. A war crime. Not one British journalist has done this. This is fantastic. He does a phenomenal job. Al Jazeera did a great job by hiring him. Let's go ahead and jump into this.
He said that the humanitarian situation, quote, will only deteriorate exponentially, and that crucial life-saving supplies, including fuel, food, and water, must be allowed into Gaza. So the UN is saying you must do this. You are saying you're not going to do this. How do you...
No, we're not saying that.
He's saying do it. He's saying doing it immediately. What I'm saying is what you're doing.
No.
He's saying doing it immediately.
I got you. I'll tell you exactly what we're saying. I'm saying we will do everything for the Gazan people. Once and now we demand immediate surrender, unconditional surrender of Hamas. If Hamas people come out with their hands up and clear their weapons, believe me, everything will be restored to Gaza. It is Hamas in Hamas hands.
Now I understand. Thank you for clarifying that, sir. I think we're actually on the same page here. You're saying that once Hamas leaves, you'll grant the Gazan people food, shelter, fuel, electricity, hospitals, schooling. And if they don't, and if Hamas doesn't leave, then they'll continue to starve and die in hospitals. You are defining for the international community right now collective punishment. You're saying until Hamas acts differently, the 2 million people in Gaza are going to be treated this way. And once Hamas acts differently, these 2 million people in Gaza will be treated better. That is exactly what collective punishment is. You're holding them accountable for the actions of others. That is the definition, the textbook definition of collective punishment, sir. Now, you may accept that that's what you want to do, but this is absolutely a contravention of international law.
Well, I'll tell you exactly. No, had we pushed them to the wall, we're not pushing them to the wall. We want to open a humanitarian corridor so they can leave. But if Hamas,
so that who can leave? Citizens? You're saying civilians can leave, but only through the Rafah border, correct?
At this point, yes.
So they can't come.
Where else?
Your country. They can come into Israel.
I'm telling you one more thing I want to say.
I want you to address that point. Don't just smile, sir, respectfully. You're saying you're making a corridor. They can go to Egypt. You're bombing them. You say you want to save them, but they can't come in.
First of all, I'm not smiling. I'm crying in my...
Spot on from Mark Lamont Hill. Great job from Al Jazeera for hiring him. They did a phenomenal job, and he's not the only person that worked for CNN that has had an awakening in recently when it comes to the nature of the heinous history of this conflict. Let's go ahead and jump into this clip in just a moment, but before we do, I want to touch on something that Mark Lamont Hill missed an opportunity to comment on when he was talking to the former Foreign Affairs Minister for Israel. Here's the deal. When they were talking about going to the Rafah crossing and the Rafah border, well, here's the deal. Israel is now bombing that crossing, which they told Palestinians to go through. So, what we see is collective punishment on top of the fact of the people who are within the foreign policy establishment of many of the governments across the world saying that they are now funneling them into these certain districts and then possibly committing war crimes upon them, even further than the ones that are already committed through that of collective punishment, as we heard Mark Lamont Hill explain in that clip. That is heinous if that's actually the case. And I've already reported this in one of my Israel-Palestine videos. I believe I've already made 3 or 4 of these at this point. Please go ahead and check them out if you're willing, if you're looking for more information on what's going on with this conflict. So, let's go ahead and jump into this clip from this guy on CNN. I'm unsure of who this is, and he's learning the history of what's going on.
But does that mean, does that mean starve the Palestinian people, continue to, because they will be so hungry and will be so desperate for water and medicine, that then they will give up Hamas?
It sounds callous, but I mean, this is a war.
But does that mean...
So, he comes to the realization, he's like, wait, does that mean that you're talking about, like, starving these people? And then he's sitting there, he's like, it sounds callous, but that's a war. So the guy in his mind is realizing, he's like, oh, we're starving 1.1 million children. Oh man, this is not the actions of the good guys. This is absolutely horrific. No good person would advocate for this. And much like someone who is, I would argue, the peak example of a good person in politics, Ron Paul, the greatest president there never was. 22 years ago, Ron Paul said the U.S. should defund all sides of conflicts in the Middle East and remain neutral. Once again, he was right. Shocker.
So it's sort of a contest. Should we be pro-Israel or pro-Arab or anti-Israel or anti-Arab? And how are we seen in doing this? And it's pretty important. But I think there's a third option to this that we so often forget about. Why can't we be pro-American? What is in the best interest of the United States? We haven't even heard that yet. I believe that it's in the best interest of the United States not to get into a fight that we don't have the wisdom to figure out. Now, I would like to have neutrality. That's been the tradition for America at least a century ago. To be friends with everybody, trade with everybody, and to be neutral, unless somebody declares war against us, but not to demand that we pick sides. So I think we should start off by defunding both sides. I'm just not for giving all this money, because every time there are civilians killed on the Israeli side or civilian killed on the Palestinian side, you can be assured that either our money was used directly or indirectly to do that killing. So we are, in a way, an accomplice on all this because we fund both sides. So
Ron Paul, right as per usual. Now, On to the really big thing that this video was spurred by. U.S. defense officials confirmed 2,500 Marines are en route to Israel-Gaza-Lebanon region. Currently en route, approximately 2,500 Marines with the 26th Marine Expeditionary Unit, the USS Bataan, the USS Carter Hall, the USS Mesa Verde, the sources from the USNI, and anyone that understands the history of something like the USS Liberty, if you are not aware, go ahead and just type that into your search bar, and you will go ahead and learn some interesting things about the history of Israel's conflict with that of the United States and striking U.S. vessels. Well, now we see that the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group has arrived in the eastern Mediterranean Sea, and this was the first ship that was sent over there. And when I saw this, my brain went off like a lightning bulb. I was like, oh my god, we are inciting power structures across the globe that will then further gin up the possibility of World War III. This is unbelievable because this is tipping our hand as to the nature of what we will be doing in this conflict, which is a major show of force when it comes to the nature of someone like Iran's reaction to what will happen to the United States. Alright, on to Mario again. He says, breaking, U.S. Senate will move to approve more funding for Israel and give Israel the tools it needs to defend itself. Majority Leader of the U.S. Senate, Chuck Schumer. And apparently they're talking about sending even more than the $1 billion that they just sent, another $10 billion on top of it. Now let's go ahead and jump into some articles that we have covering the nature of what's going on. Let's go. Before we jump into the specific articles I have selected just to cover the highlights of what's going on with the escalation of this conflict, I wanted to jump in and just show the nature of antiwar.com and how valuable it is as an asset to be able to cultivate a large well of information that you can extrapolate many of your different opinions from, because you can extract so many different perspectives from so many different approaches from many of the different writers and contributors from antiwar.com, as well as places like the Libertarian Institute. So, here we have so much commentary on so many of the different things. We have the highlights up top, we have breaking news, we have Scott Horton show. Here we have the news, the Israeli president, no innocent civilians in Gaza. And here we see Israeli military says it's in formation to strike. Here we see the State Department memo says no Gaza de-escalation talk. Israel again bombed Syria's Aleppo airport. Former Ukrainian official counteroffensive is a disaster. NATO vows response in Finland pipeline was sabotaged. Blinken warns lawmakers Azerbaijan may invade Armenia. And here we see so many different escalations of so many different conflicts, and a great place to find out about the nature of so many of them is antiwar.com. And if you want information on so many of these different conflicts, you can see what's going on with the front line. And here, if you scroll down, you'll see the different contributors, and as well as the fact of all of the different onslaughts that have been fought across the war and currently. And with it, you can see the topics that are being talked about with these different conflicts, from Gaza to world reaction to the Gaza onslaught, to Israel, to the West Bank and East Jerusalem, to the Middle East, to Turkey, Afghanistan, Africa, China, Pakistan, Russia, the United Kingdom, the war at home in the United States, Europe, Latin America, and Azerbaijan. There is so much you can glean from antiwar.com, even if you were just skimming through the headlines because you were trying to understand the nature of what was causing these pieces of escalation. Alright, now let's go ahead and jump into the rest of these. We'll be starting with the post-millennial. Breaking. The Biden admin has selected 2,000 troops to prepare to deploy in Israel. The troops will not serve in combat roles. Yeah, I'm sure. And just like the fact is that this apparently won't lead to further escalation, much like many of the people in the foreign policy establishment talk about the fact that, well, if we're funding Ukraine, it doesn't mean we're actually involved in the war. I mean, I know that we're giving them all of the armaments that they're using to expunge against the Russian military, and with it, we're also giving them the majority of their funding that's allowing them to withstand this barrage from the Russians. But I mean, we're not involved in the actual conflict. Does anyone actually believe that shit? On to CNN, U.S. sending second carrier strike group fighter jets as well to the region as Israel prepares to expand Gaza's operation. Well, what we see is that we are now pushing more and more intensely into a place that is not our sphere of influence, and we see another one from CNN saying, U.S. Marine Rapid Response Force moving towards Israel as Pentagon strengthens military posture in region. So not only do we have the Gerald R. Ford, the first carrier to arrive, which is the biggest carrier that we have the multiple carrier group, and now we have the U.S. Marine Rapid Response Force moving towards the conflict itself. Isn't that interesting? But don't worry, there's no escalation going on. Here we see from the Military Times, 2,000 U.S. troops on notice to deploy as Israel-Hamas war intensifies. Well, isn't that just fascinating? And with it, as I've already talked about in my previous video when I was covering this conflict and talking about the fact of what's going on with Ukraine, which I believe we'll be releasing after this if the times end up meeting the way that I end up scheduling this properly. So, here's the deal. We've seen John Kirby openly come out and talk about the fact, well, we're going to have to wind down the Ukraine funding because we now see that it's not feasible to go ahead and fund this to the extent that we have been. And why is that? It's because we can't fund wars on every single front possible. We can't intervene in the Azerbaijan conflict. We can't fund the war between Israel and Hamas. We can't fund the war between Ukraine and Russia. We can't worry and fund the conflict that is going to be escalating between Taiwan and China. We certainly can't fund the war of what's going on between the invasion at the southern border and the U.S. actually countering that with any sort of funding because we're spending all of our money abroad. But that doesn't really matter to these people. They're just going to go ahead and escalate conflict abroad, and with it, they will sit there and act like it is no big deal that this will lead to more civilians dying. And with it, they will consistently advocate for things like furthering the draft, because if you think that they would not gladly sign up your brothers, sisters, sons, daughters, mothers and fathers, uncles, aunts, nephews and nieces, every single person you know and love, to go die in these wars abroad, then you are a fucking idiot. Now, let's go ahead and jump in, and here we see Israel has asked the U.S. for $10 billion in emergency military aid. This is from the Times of Israel. Israel has asked the United States for $10 billion in emergency military aid, the New York Times reports, citing 3 officials familiar with the request. The aid package is currently being put together by Congress in coordination with the White House and will also include funds for Ukraine. Of course it will. Funds for Taiwan and the U.S.-Mexico border. Well, here's the thing that I find so fascinating about this. What would be the discrepancies of the distributions of this money? Because what's so interesting is we just saw them talk about the fact when John Kirby was coming out saying that we're dwindling our funding for Ukraine, he said that we will be sending them $200 million and that will be earmarking the end of our funding and we will be dwindling it down from there. And with that, does that mean we will just be consistently escalating our funding for the war, what we see with Israel and Hamas, and possibly furthering that with the invasion and war with Iran? Because we've seen so many people within the U.S. foreign policy establishment consistently talk about for years that they have wanted to go to war with Iran. All right, now we're going to go ahead and jump in, and this is just one thing, and this is from Joshua Smith, and it says, I hope they draft Ben Shapiro first. And I just wanted to go ahead and bring this up because I thought it was funny, because Ben Shapiro is consistently talking about the fact that, well, what we need to do is fund Israel to the end of time, basically, and he's openly talking about the fact that we need to get involved in this conflict. And this has been a complete switch up from all of his rhetoric throughout the years. He went from talking about the fact of how much of a problem it was that we were focusing on identity politics only when Israel comes into the conversation to switch up and focus solely on identity politics based on his Jewish identity. And with that, Ben Shapiro is someone who is nothing more than a neoconservative, proving himself that he is nowhere near the ideal of America first as he is purported. Ben Shapiro stepping into the fray, showing he is nothing more than Israel first. I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. Thank you for watching if you got this far. Thumbs up if you liked it. Thumbs down if you didn't. Tell me where I'm wrong in the comment section down below. Subscribe if you like this kind of content. Do not fall for the propaganda that is being pushed around this entire conflict. Just realize that the nature of escalation will only lead to the deaths of more innocent people, and that is the thing that should be avoided at all costs. Stay lovely, stay great. Peace out.